Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to the talk by Dr. Justin Gest. So my name is Hisano. I'm an associate professor at the Graduate School of Interdisciplinary Information Studies at the University of Tokyo. And today, I'm honored to introduce and have a wonderful guest, Dr. Justin Gest from George Mason University. He is an associate professor of policy and government at George Mason University, Chair Scholar of Policy and Government, Chair School of Policy and Government, and he's already the sixth author of 6 books, primarily on the politics of immigration and demographic change. And he's going to talk today about his latest book, Majority Minority, which was published from the University of Oxford Press. And Professor Gest earned his bachelor's degree in government at Harvard University and his PhD in government from the LSE London School of Economics. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Gest. So again, we would like to have this event interactive. So first, he's going to talk about his project book for 15 minutes at the beginning, and then we will have some questions. I will have some questions to him, and he will answer those questions. But feel free to raise your hands or ask questions if you have during his talk. Thank you.
こんにちは。It's very good to be with you. Thank you to Hisano Sensei for inviting me and for hosting me. I'm really grateful and honored to be with you guys today and to share some reflections from my most recent book. My presentation is going to be very short, maybe 15, 20 minutes maximum, as Hisano Sensei was saying about in order to make time for questions and to make it a more conversational approach. So the presentation is based on my new book, Majority Minority. The primary research question that interests me in this work, and I think is also important in the current context, not just in Western countries which are experiencing very large amounts of immigration and demographic change, but also in a variety of developed economies that are now opening up to immigration, such as Japan, such as Korea, such as Singapore, and much of the Middle East right now. And that is, how can democracies navigate great demographic change? And of course, limiting our scope to democracies obviously means that we're not thinking as much about the Middle East or Singapore, but it's something that I think that many developed economies, advanced industrial economies are thinking about right now as their demography changes in order to meet global competitive needs for human capital and global economic development. And so this fundamental question motivates this idea and this question. So countries attempt to control demographic change in a variety of different ways. And it's something in many ways that is uncontrollable, if you think about it. There's so much we cannot control. We cannot control, or at least it's very challenging to control how many children people produce. Certainly there have been countries that have attempted to control how many children, both in order to increase fertility or to actually reduce population numbers. But it's very difficult to control. It's very difficult to control who people marry. So the extent to which you have interracial or interreligious marriage, and therefore mixed religion or mixed racial children. So there's a lot of things we can't control. Also, like when people die, countries can try to facilitate healthcare and try to make it open and cultivate good health among a population. But people ultimately make good or bad health choices that limits their life expectancy or extends it in different ways. However, these difficulties, this uncontrollable phenomenon, has not stopped governments from trying to control these things. And in the course of my work, I find that there are three principal ways that states do try to control demographic change. And we can summarize these ideas by focusing on three questions: who comes, who counts, and who connects. So who comes is really a reference to immigration. States have immense control over the admission, the removal, and the naturalization of citizens or of its people. So states can control the number of people who enter. They can control the attributes of those people, where they are coming from, what countries, what ethnic backgrounds, what educational levels of educational attainment, what age groups. They can control who they deport, who they remove, and they can control the status of those immigrants to ensure that they are either temporary in nature or have an opportunity to stay permanently. They can also control how temporary, the amount of renewals to a visa. So states actually can control it quite a bit. And immigration is a global phenomenon, but unlike other global phenomena, such as pollution and climate change, contamination, global trade and global finance, it is much easier to actually control immigration because you are monitoring it, you are regulating it one person at a time, one border at a time. Who counts is a reference to power. States can control the extent to which numbers translates into power. So you may bring in many immigrants, you may bring in many people of different ethnic or racial or religious backgrounds, but the extent to which they hold power and can wield power in your society, states can control by how they distribute electoral power. So that relates to people's eligibility to vote, the gerrymandering and division of electoral districts and precincts, and also the way that censuses count people for the distribution of resources. The third way that states control demographic change is by the extent to which people can connect. And that is the extent of intergroup interaction. States can control the segregation of schools, the segregation of residential neighborhoods, the segregation of labor markets. They can control or they can create group-specific institutions by actually assigning certain people to certain institutions, having those institutions serve only certain people, or make it eligible only for certain people. And obviously the governance of schools also affects who connects, because schools in many ways are where children are interacting with each other and the next generational cohort meets. So states have attempted to control the uncontrollable in a variety of different ways. But what we are up against in diverse democracies or diversifying democracies, and just as a sort of parenthetical, I think that while this will sound very familiar, what I'm about to say, for countries like the United States, like Canada, like Britain, like Australia, like France or Germany, which have already diversified enormously, in many ways, I see this as a sort of canary in the coal mine, the helpful predecessor for countries like Korea or Japan, which are beginning to diversify, in some cases reluctantly, in other cases perhaps by necessity, but nevertheless something that could be very much of interest to sort of peer into the future, or to try to at least anticipate the challenges that such diversification creates. So what are we up against? We're up against human psychology in many ways. What the psychology research shows is that when people are exposed to demographic change, it intensifies intolerance and tribalism inside of a population. When people are alerted to the growth of minority groups, they protect their in-group position in a very defensive way, territorially. And when people are exposed to demographic change, it elevates exclusionary attitudes among native populations. And finally, immigration and racial attitudes have been demonstrated to be very persistent and rigid. They don't change easily through attempts to persuade. And so we are really up against a lot. These are some of the hardest attitudes to adjust.
to make people more open to the presence of people who look or are culturally different. And what makes this worse is that when the exposure takes place, human nature tends to turn more inward and to be less inclusive, less tolerant, and more defensive. In this book, I study a variety of societies that have experienced great demographic change. So in the United States, we are approaching a remarkable milestone where white people, or people who are at least construed historically as white, are confronted with the possibility that they will become a minority in the United States by 2045. The US Census expects that due to a variety of fertility rate differentials and also immigration trends, that white people in the United States will be less than 50% of the country in the 2040s, a mere generation away. However you feel about this prospect, it looms as almost a shadow over the politics of the United States, altering the way people vote and the way that they perceive their own country, questioning both the sort of future of its nation and the definition of the nation itself. Many Americans and observers of the United States see this as something unique in the world, something truly extraordinary that has never happened before. But in fact, actually, a look through history shows that while this is, it's not unique, but it is rare. There are a number of societies, small island societies with fragile demographies that have in fact experienced great demographic change, such that the original or native majority group loses its numerical advantage at some point in history. And so I study 6 of these societies. There's only about a dozen real examples over time where immigration is the driver that sort of mimics the United States experience. And these countries include Singapore, which became a majority minority country instantly with its creation in 1965, when a Chinese dominant city of the Malay Federation became a Chinese dominant country, sovereign country unto itself, a city-state. Mauritius in the Western Indian Ocean, a small island there which was initially founded as a slave-based plantation economy, first by the Dutch, then by the French, and then by the British, but was completely revolutionized by what was called the Great Experiment, when indentured servants were brought in from India, and though that population came to outnumber the African Creole original population. Bahrain, an island off the coast of the Arabian Peninsula, is a fascinating place that is majority minority twice. First, because they have more immigrants than nationals. So the foreign-born population is a 57% share of the national population, which is remarkable in itself. But those immigrants tend to not receive permanent status. And so while it's a majority minority state, the nationals remain predominantly Arab, however, and Muslim. However, inside of the national population, there's another majority minority transformation taking place, because the state is deliberately trying to tilt the population in favor of Sunni Muslims as opposed to Shia. It is historically a Shia majority, and the state is altering naturalization trends in order to change this. Trinidad and Tobago is a small set of islands in the Eastern Caribbean. It follows the same story as Mauritius, a slave-based, plantation-based economy, really through the 19th century, that was altered with the importation of labor from India. New York City, which was an Anglo-Dutch first colony and then state of the United States, but the city was one of the primary destinations for people who were fleeing the famine in Ireland in 1845 until 1854. And the arrival of the Irish in New York City completely transformed the city into an immigrant destination, but also its politics. The Irish that came during that period, that decade, outnumbered all other immigration to the United States combined until that point in the country's history, which is really quite remarkable. And it set the tone and opened the door for the Germans, Italians, Jews, Greeks, Slavs that came into the United States thereafter. And then finally, the Hawaiian Kingdom, which many people associate with being its own, being a state, not its own country. But of course, Hawaii was its own country up until the US annexed the territory in 1893, forcibly through a bloodless coup, largely bloodless coup. Before that actually happened, the state's majority of Native Hawaiians was decimated first by epidemic, by disease, but then also by the importation of labor from Japan, China, and the Philippines, as far away as even Portugal and Puerto Rico, in order to fuel a really tremendous sugar-based economy. And those immigrants who came from mostly East Asia came to outnumber the Native Hawaiian population and eventually intermarry. So each of these 6 cases is incredibly instructive and didactic for the experience of a variety of other cases, including the United States, but also a variety of countries in Europe. And as I mentioned earlier, in Japan and Korea as well, which are now opening up to immigration in a way that is effectively unprecedented in its history. And I think that that is a sort of subtext for all of this work. In short, what the book is arguing for states that are actively considering what to do about diversifying populations and the effect on its politics is to meet people where they are. So frequently, we believe that prejudice, intolerance, racism are insurmountable hurdles, obstacles to progress. And we believe, I think that many people believe that we cannot actually make progress until we eradicate intolerance, until we eradicate nativism. What I argue actually from this book is quite the opposite. Even in the most successfully well-adjusted coexisting societies, prejudice and intolerance persists. In many ways, prejudice and intolerance is the turf, is the ground upon which progress must be made. Majority-minority milestones, the diversification of democracies and their populations, are inherently governed. They are managed. They are not subject to the chaos of public opinion and humans' worst instincts, most tribal instincts. Governments possess enormous ability to model the change they want to see in the world. They possess enormous ability to create institutions that facilitate intercultural and intergroup contact. They have amazing power to construct social boundaries and deconstruct social boundaries. And to suggest that governments and societies are instead actually subject to these chaotic whims of human psychology, to me, is actually a miscarriage and mischaracterization of government. Government possesses enormous power, as do a number of other civil institutions from civil society and also businesses, to actually overcome the challenges presented by demographic change. How do they do it then, is the natural next question for me. And the answer is to meet people where they are. And here's what I mean by that. Successful leaders do not work against where people are in their ideas. Many people confront immigration and demographic change from a very nationalist perspective. And for those people on the left and the progressive side of politics, nationalism is vile, it's foul, it's exclusive. But actually, nationalism, I believe, is too powerful of a human sentiment and preference to ignore. And actually, I think that there's great potential, and I find in my work that nationalism should be leveraged in order to persuade people to support immigration and demographic change, because immigration and demographic change is actually fundamental to the sustainability of the nation. It is actually fundamental to national survival. And so smart leaders confronting a diversifying country do not fear nationalism. They actually embrace it and leverage it to persuade. This also can mean engaging and empowering trusted leaders of opinion who co-identify with nationalist skeptics. In many cases, that means embracing people who are reflecting the views of nationalists and reflect their own phenotypical appearance and religious preferences and cultural norms, and to engage them as messengers and partners in the process of trying to adapt to demographic change rather than resist it. And that means crafting messages in those nationalist terms. to employ the logic of national survival. In the United States, there is this concept of a Chinese finger trap. It is this sort of woven bamboo tubes that people put their fingers in. And the natural human instinct is to pull your fingers out. And when you do that, you're only tightening the bamboo around your fingers. The way to actually get out of the Chinese finger trap is to push your fingers into the bamboo so that it loosens in order to pull your fingers out. And in many ways, that is kind of the metaphor for what I'm suggesting. We don't want to resist where cultural tension and attitudinal trends are going. We actually want to lean into them and decouple them so that we can actually leverage those same tensions in our own favor to produce the kind of change that is actually both affirmative but also beneficial for the nation's survival. If you're interested more in this argument, I published an essay in the Washington Post back in February, which is searchable online. What is the challenge before us? So, as I mentioned earlier, states and elites hold enormous power to overcome prejudice and nativism because of their power to build institutions, to tear them down, to make social constructions and to deconstruct them, to model the change that they want to see. We cannot wait for a different media environment. I know many people lament the way that media today is so atomized, so cacophonous, so proliferated, such that it's difficult to control. And the way that it's sort of driven by clicks, driven by the sort of most base propensities of human consumers. But we cannot actually wait for a new media environment to adapt to this new future. We cannot wait for new institutions to be built or for the eradication of prejudice. As I mentioned earlier, these institutions, this media environment, that prejudice is the ground upon which we must build and be resilient. And finally, it requires specific policy and specific strategy. So in the United States, a country that has been subject to great demographic change since its founding, since its inception, we are a country that has no institution that is specifically dedicated to facilitating national solidarity. There is no committee on the Capitol Hill that is designed to address social solidarity. There is no office in the White House that is tasked with social cohesion. There is no special aide to the president who is concerned about these things. We do not have the policy infrastructure right now. That is a mistake. Very few countries actually have this kind of infrastructure. Nationalism, national solidarity, I should say, social cohesion is something that we tend to assume. It's something that we anticipate in every country as being organic, as being naturally occurring. But in fact, actually, a very quick look through history shows that government actually does a lot rhetorically and institutionally to control national cohesion, both to either consolidate it or to shred it in its own interests. And what I'm saying is that this shouldn't be a byproduct, an afterthought, an indirect effect of our work, an externality. It actually should be the direct goal of our work. And a country that actually does a very good job thinking about these matters is Singapore. So Singapore is quite paradoxical, but at a minimum, no matter what we may say about its sort of racially driven policies of a lot of segregation in the country, they actually do think very carefully about how to actually facilitate social solidarity and cohesion in a diverse country. If you're interested in these ideas, I wrote an essay for Politico last year. I've written actually a number of pieces for Politico, but if you search my name online with Politico in the field, you'll see a number of essays on the subject matter. How do organizations, how do institutions do these things? Well, first, we should acknowledge what are the 5 pivots where states actually move towards exclusion or inclusion. And I'm sure we'll get into this in the discussion with Hisano sensei, but I'll just name them now and we can talk more about them and unpack them. This is a really rich, fertile place for discussion. The first is ideology, the national ideology of who we are. The second is education and the socialization of youth. The third is through culture, the arts, music, literature, cuisine, sport, athletics, can be a place both of inclusion and exclusion. Commerce, the world of commerce can be a place of segmentation and segregation, or one of great interdependency. And finally, the politics of threat, whether we identify the threats to the nation to be external and internally unifying, or internal and divisive. How do states, how do institutions, both public and private, make these choices in a way that is progressive? They ask three questions. And you'll find more of this, by the way, in a piece that I wrote for CNN Opinion in November of 2020, just ahead of the US election. It was actually October 2020. So the first question is, does our action reinforce or break down social boundaries between Americans? And of course, you can replace Americans with whatever nationality you're thinking of, in this case, possibly Japan. Does our action reinforce the social boundaries that divide us, or actually try to break down those boundaries? Second, how can our action facilitate intergroup connections? Throughout my research, the power of intergroup contact comes through, whether it's through intermarriage or close proximity residential mixing. Third, will people trust each other? Will they trust this institution more by virtue of our action, or less? And I think that if every action, before any major actions are taken, whether by business, civil society, or government, ask themselves these three questions, they will be thinking in a way that is anticipating the need for unification and for social solidarity in the face of greater diversity. The United States, to conclude, the United States has a number of advantages, I will say, in confronting diverse democracies. We have a number of disadvantages too, I will mention, namely our political polarization and our really detrimental political institutions, which are really outdated for the country that we have become. But setting aside those things, it is worth acknowledging what makes the United States different from our European friends, from our East Asian friends. We are different in a few key ways, and they're advantageous. And I talk about this in a New York Times piece that I wrote in August of 2021. The first is that minorities are not of the same background, which means you cannot simply say it's, Americans against another group, or you have one big group coming in and there's a bifurcation, a duality in society. That's not what happens, right? We have over 100 different nationalities represented in the United States. We have over 100 religious groups and sects. We have over 100 languages being spoken in the United States. It's an incredibly diverse country, and all of those different boundaries and groups are intersecting, which creates an infinite amount of combinations. And so diversity is not coming from one group. That makes it much more difficult to split the country. But that has not stopped fearmongers from doing so. Increasingly, people are leveraging the majority-minority milestone as a way to reinforce the sanctity of whiteness to US identity. That is a huge challenge that we are facing. It is overly simplistic, and it completely denies the incredible diversity, the hyper-diversity of the country that is effectively indivisible. Second, immigration in the United States is not new. Not only is it not new, it is fundamental to who the country is. It began at its inception, right? Certainly initially by genocidal settlers, but thereafter by immigrants that have continued to replenish the population, diversify it, and create a sense of ingenuity and innovation. It has also been largely planned. So the government actually has relative control over the immigration. A very small fraction of the immigrants are undocumented and irregular. Despite obviously all the politics around it, we're talking about only 10 million people in total, and a very small amount on an annual basis. So generally immigration, despite the visuals, what we actually see is actually generally orderly. So it's not a complete refugee crisis like you might be seeing in a place like Bangladesh or like Jordan or like Turkey right now. Third, the United States has actually reached a majority-minority milestone before. In many ways, we are our own case study. So at the turn of the 20th century, this was a period of great cultural change, because beginning with the Irish in the 1850s and 40s, then came enormous amount of diversity from many European countries. The groups I mentioned earlier, Germans, Italians, Irish, Jews, Greeks, Slavs, Middle Easterners, all began to come to the country, but also East Asians coming from Japan and China as well during that period. And during this period, the concept of whiteness began to change, because the Anglo-Protestant white people that preceded the idea of whiteness in the United States was no longer sustainable with a population that was diversifying in the way it was. And what ended up happening is that many of these European origin groups and Levantine groups came to be embraced as fellow white people. White ethnics is what they were called at the time. But in promoting these white ethnic groups, it came at the expense of the continued subjugation of people of African origin, people of Asian origin, and eventually people of Latin origins. So there were some people who were deemed not white enough, or who were deemed unassimilable, which is a word that was actually frequently used to describe what were then called Asiatics in the United States, mostly people from China, but also in places like California, also the Japanese. So we have reached this minority milestone before, and the way we dealt with it was not to actually embrace the diversification of the country, was actually to ignore it by actually amalgamating more people into whiteness. We cannot afford to do that today. And for those of you who are wondering, well, how might you do that today? The answer is that we have a lot of Hispanic people in the United States who self-identify as white racially. 60% of US Latinos self-identify as white already. We also have a large amount of mixed marriages, which I'll discuss in the very last point. And 80% of them are with one white parent. And so they're creating populations that very well may self-identify as white in the future. Meanwhile, the final American advantage is that minorities now reach every region of the United States. They're concentrated on the coasts, they're concentrated in big cities, but they are penetrating the hinterlands of the country. And people who identify as mixed race or mixed ethnic backgrounds has tripled in just the last 10 years. And this is a product of more mixed race marriages, but it's also the product of more comfort in self-identifying as mixed, or as Hapa, as it's called in Hawaii. So all of this, I hope, gives some fodder for conversation with both Hisano Sensei and also the rest of you. So I'll go ahead and conclude. Some of these things will stimulate your own thoughts. I really encourage you to reach out to me after this anytime. I put my Twitter handle up in case you want to follow me. My website, where you'll find more details about the book, is just my name, justingest.com. And I also place my email here in case you ever want to reach out in the future. But again, arigatou gozaimasu. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.